The last presentation of today is mine. My name is Marloes Kraan. I'm a marine social scientist working at Wageningen University in the Netherlands. I'm also one of the co-chairs of WG Social here at ICES. In this presentation, I will present the assessment framework we are developing at WG Social, which can be helpful for quick scientific responses following a shock such as COVID-19. When it became clear that COVID-19 became a pandemic and first feedbacks were heard about the impact, we decided to come together in a meeting to share our insights. Having the working group members from many different countries in ICES territory was very useful. The first feedback reports were based on what we had heard in our countries from fishers, traders, but also from the media. And from this meeting we realized that the impact differed in the different cultural contexts, but also differed because the impact of the pandemic was so varied. The meeting was in April this year, and when the north of Italy was under severe and acute stress and in lockdown, in Norway, for instance, there were mostly preventive measures. We also realized that COVID-19 is an example of a shock, and that studying the impact whilst it was unfolding would be useful for industry and governments, and that having a comparative framework to do this would be very useful. Lastly, we realized that this crisis showed us how crucial it is to have baseline data readily available so that impacts can be better understood. And as WG Social, we are in the process of developing social indicators for ecosystem assessments and impact studies. So we discussed how this crisis of COVID-19 could help us prioritize our work on developing social indicators and underlying data collection. By understanding this pandemic as an example of a shock, we laid out the contours of an assessment framework. First, it would be good to understand which types of shocks there are that can impact the fishing industry, so that we could learn from research in different cases and contexts for this situation. Secondly, it's important to make a choice as to the scale of the impact that you want to assess, and look at what different or affected sectors you want to look at, so subparts of the value chain. Obviously, you need a research design and what could be the leading questions in your framework. The goal of the assessment framework is to be able to move quickly, as it helps in structuring the work and making choices, and it is also useful for comparability. COVID-19 is an example of a shock, but there are many more examples of shocks that can have an impact on the fishing industry. There can be a regime change, or more subtly, a policy change. There could be a social disaster, a natural disaster, or there could be disasters in relation to climate change. All these examples of shocks impact the fishing industry and society in different ways. They can also they can differ in terms of onset. It could be a rapid impact and also a rapid shock versus a very slowly evolving one, like climate change is an example of a slowly evolving change or shock with rapid happenings related to it. The duration can also be short-term or long-term, or as in example with COVID-19, be short-term in upsurges of the virus, but long-term in how long it stays with us. The shocks are not necessarily mutually exclusive. There could be a natural disaster being followed by a social disaster, and there could also be the possibility of cascading effects. But what is useful of making this overview, for us at least, it showed that there are examples of, for instance, hurricanes in the United States, and that the way you study the effect of a hurricane is useful in the approach of studying it for COVID-19, as Doug Lipton talked about. To study the impact of a shock requires making a choice of the level at which you want to understand the impact. Such choice impacts the research method and data availability. Again, what is interesting about COVID-19 is that it has global implications in ways that are unprecedented, and this has also become clear for its impact on fisheries. Local lockdowns in country A can impact fisheries in country B. Also, with other shocks, fisheries are affected, but trade is up and running. But now fisheries is also impacted because of trade lines being interrupted. So the pandemic has showed us how global fisheries are actually organized. Another choice to make is whether to zoom into a part of the fishing industry or to look at the whole value chain. And obviously there are different ways in which this value chain can be organized in the different countries in different contexts. And so you can focus on understanding the impact of COVID-19 on the production side and then make a choice between commercial fishing, aquaculture, or subsistence fishing. Or you can look at the whole chain and the relation between production and consumption. And in the case of direct sales, this is a fairly simple value chain, but obviously there can be many more steps in between. And again, in the situation of COVID-19, what was interesting is that all of these parts were impacted in different ways throughout the globe. So the processing industry has had impacts, the sales, the transport, and consumers also found themselves in different situations. What was interesting was that in some cases, and I think Christina Pita has spoken about this, in some cases due to COVID-19, these value chains also changed. Innovations were made where there was direct sales from some small-scale fishers to consumers by using apps and web-based interfaces. The research design lays out what all the formative aspects are, such as the theoretical angle of the study, who asks for the study, how it will be used, what the scope of the study is, the methods that will and can be used depending on resources and availability of data, and the type of analysis. As social scientists, we find it important that doing such an impact study is to be theory-driven, and the concepts of resilience and vulnerability are particularly useful to understand the ability to respond to shock and return to pre-shock state or to transform to a new state based on pre-existing conditions. By using an assessment framework for shocks, it helps to see that there are certain questions that are relevant to all shock types, and we formulated 5 basic questions. First, you want to understand what is the normal situation. And ideally, you have data sets that you can make use of describing what the normal situation is. But otherwise, it's also something you need to sketch out. The second question, obviously, is what's the impact of the shock? And what are the societal impacts we're particularly interested in? The third question that is relevant to ask is, are there any compounding stressors taking place, making the impact of the shock greater or on the contrary, helping people to cope with the shock? The fourth question is, what are the implications occurring across the sectors? And these can be practical implications of IUU fishing or human rights abuse or lack of transparency, and we've seen a couple of examples of these across the world. And depending on how long these changes will last, the final question basically is, will this impact of the shock result in social transformation, or will there be a return to business as usual? So in the example of the small-scale fishermen practicing more with direct sales, will that definitely change the way they relate to consumers, or will they eventually change back to the old situation? In relation to COVID-19, there are a couple of extra questions we formulated so far. First is, for instance, how do safety measures impact across sectors? What's the implications of those safety measures for how sectors are dealing with COVID-19? Another question is, how does the level of fishing dependence affect the level of impact? And the third question we thought about was, if there is a situation of lack of transparency, does it also mean that some invisible concerns become visible due to what happened? And I think an interesting example of that is the level of payment for people working in the processing industry being quite low, making them not too resilient to deal with a shock like this. And due to COVID-19, this all of a sudden became visible. So a couple of conclusions after presenting the assessment framework that we would like to share. So the aim of the framework is that it helps in the comparability between cases. It is actually possible to compare impacts of hurricanes with impacts of COVID-19 by having such a framework. It can serve as a guide to make relevant choices in relation to scale and subsector you want to look at, or the whole value chain. It shows the importance of the socio-cultural context. So there are these different situations of value change. There are these compounding stressors that are impacting the impact of a shock. And the usefulness of having a theoretical lens. We thought that the concepts of resilience and vulnerability were particularly useful because if you want to understand how necessary certain measures are, it is also necessary to understand the resilience of people to the shock. And the final conclusion is that there is a need for social indicators and data so that we can better understand the baseline situation also on the social side. So apart from the landings and the money that is earned, understanding these factors, for instance, of people's capability to deal with shocks is also something you can translate into social indicators. That was my last slide. Thanks for listening, and I'm happy to answer your questions.